Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm part of the CEDLA, the Center for Latin American Research and Documentation at the University of Amsterdam. I'm Julienne Wegels. I work as an assistant professor at the university and CEDLA. And it's my pleasure to be chairing this lecture, a very exciting lecture that will be taught by Professor Marcelo Bergman, who is joining us, I think, from his holiday location far across the world. It's very early for him. So thank you so much, Marcelo, for sacrificing an early morning to teach your lecture to us. I'll give a brief introduction of Marcelo and first tell you what this day will look like. So Marcelo will teach a 25 to 30 minutes lecture, followed by comments from our discussant, Professor Kees Konings, who I will introduce when he starts to give his comments. So Marcelo Bergman is a professor of sociology and criminology at the University Nacional 3 de Febrero in Argentina. He writes on a variety of issues which are related to crime, public security, illegal drugs, and public policies in Latin America. He's also the founder and director of the research center CELIV, which is about the understanding of violence, and director of the master's program in criminology and citizen security at his university. And he's also a prominent member of the Latin American Society of Criminology. It's our pleasure to have Marcelo here, unfortunately in the virtual rather than the physical space, but we very much look forward to his lecture, which will treat his new book, More Money, More Crime. The floor is yours, Marcelo.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for to CEDLA, to Julien, to Kees, and other friends for the opportunity to be with you. Indeed, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, my time. So, but I'm very happy to be with you. And what I'm going to do in the next 25 to 30 minutes is make a presentation, a very brief summary of parts of my book, of 2018 book called More Money, More Crime, which try to explain the rise in crime, which has been dramatic in Latin America over the last, I would say, 2 decades or 2.5 decades. So I prepared a PowerPoint. It will help. There's a lot of numbers, but you don't have to pay attention to all of them, but just to have a general feelings. My presentation, so I'm going to share it. I'm going to share screen and go to the PowerPoint. I'm going to explain step by step. So let me. Are you able to see this? Okay, so here it is. This is the original title that I tried to persuade the editor to have for the book. He really liked the idea, More Money, More Crime. I like this because it synthesized or summarized what I tried to present today, which is, well, in Latin America, we have two processes, well, several processes, but these are two related processes. There was a rise in crime, and there was some kind of prosperity. It's not that, you know, we do have a Western Europe type of prosperity, but Latin America had done particularly great in between 2000 and 2015 overall. And you see, well, what happened? Why we do have so much crime when you have social and economic indicators that have been relatively good for several years. So here it is. I'm going to try to go somewhat quickly. Let me see why I'm not able to move. So what happens here? Okay. Are you able to see it? Okay. So here is a glimpse of what I'm trying to explain. If you can see on the last screen, let me just do something that it's disturbing. Okay. If you see the last column, it's summarized in the different regions of the world, the difference in homicide rates between 2000 and 2012. And as you can see, the only region in the world that had a rising trend in homicide is Latin America. Not only that, when you see the fourth and fifth column, I'm sorry, the total homicides column, you see the numbers are particularly great, or the rate. In the rest of, for instance, in Europe, you have a 2.6 and a 1.3 homicides per 100,000. In Latin America, you are able to see at least almost 10 times larger rates of homicides as in Europe. So not only crime went up in Latin America as opposed to the rest of the world, it also, the numbers are staggering. I don't know why this is not working the way I wanted to, but okay. So here it is. We have between 2000 and 2015, over that period of time, less poverty, less inequality, lower unemployment, and economic growth. All these indicators will suggest that we should have less crime. But here in Latin America, we had more crime at the same time. So my book tries to explain what happened. So as a very, very summary, I will say what you have is not only the rise in homicides, which I will claim that is a byproduct of other type of crimes. You also have, particularly you have a rise in two type of, I call it crime for profits, which are property crimes and drug-related crimes. Particularly on property crime, there is not a lot of literature and not a lot of attention, but I will claim that the rise in property crime is the driver of most of the crime in Latin America. So what I'm going to do some numbers, not a lot, but one of the, so bear with me. I will also claim that the rise in crime happened not only in several large countries or small countries, but it happened in all 18 countries of Latin America. You will see particularly that in property crime, there is a rise in every country, and also in violent crime, which is homicides. What you see here on the last column, you see the rate of change on homicides. I don't know how much you're familiar with criminological issues, but homicides are being measured as the number of homicides that happen in a year per 100,000 inhabitants. For instance, in Argentina in 1995, there was the rate was 7.8 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And the last column will show the rate of change between 1995 and 2012. What is in parentheses usually is that when the year changed. For instance, in Argentina, we compare to 2013. In Ecuador, we compare it to 2010. That's because of the availability of data. So you will see that every country but Colombia had an increase in homicide rates throughout this period. In Colombia, you will see a significant rate, but you have to take in consideration 1995 was at the peak, or almost at the peak of homicides in that country. It was a tremendous rate of 57.9. So easily you can claim that that homicides went up in all countries of the region but Colombia, that had already very high rate. Something that I really want to stress is that the rise in crime occurred in a very short period of time. This is one of the findings of the book also. You will see I took several countries that had a significant rise in criminality. You see the last column, and the period, the first and last year of the measures. And you see that these staggering increases occur in brief periods of time. 7 years, 8 years, 4 years, 5 years. Take Mexico. From 2007 to 2011, the rate of homicides tripled, an increase in 200%. And similarly, you see in other countries as well. So let me show other type of crimes. This is victimization, which usually you are talking about small criminal, or not relatively small, people that are being mugged or robbed, or got in scuffles, but usually this relate to property crime. And in the last column, again, you see this is taken from surveys from Latino Barometro. And what you see is an increase in every country, but 3, which are Central America. And the reasons that you see a drop there is because in 1995, these countries emerged from civil wars, basically, or civil strife, and they had a very high rates of property crime in 1995 or 1996. So basically you see, let me show you another graph. This is for countries this is administrative data, that is to say reported to police property crime. I put everything in 1991 at 0, and you see a very, very important rises in property crime as well. And this is the last slide on the rise in crime. This is one typical type of criminality that I stress much in the book, which allows me also to develop the theory, is the car thefts or robberies of cars, of vehicles. And here you see that every country, in a span of 4 or 5 years, you see a very, very important increase or rise in the rate of car theft. The Brazil, you see a decline, but the decline here is because in 2010, we lack measures of 2 large states, which are Minas Gerais, which is a very large state, and Rio Grande do Sul. So if we, and I couldn't get the data for that, but if you had the data, then it will show an increase in car robberies in Brazil as well. So here are the key findings of the first section of my presentation. Crime has been rising in all Latin American countries. There is a notorious rise in property crime. The pace and intensity of the rising trend differs between countries. That is to say, you see countries that have large increases in criminality and countries that had relatively steady and small increases year to year. And there is a sharp increase in crime and violence that happen in very short spans in some of the countries, not all of them. And I will try to explain, my argument will try to explain why some countries had explosions of criminality, like Mexico or Brazil or Colombia, etc., while other countries had an increase in criminality, but steady and not dramatic, like Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, etc. Well, traditional explanations of crime, people are familiar with the literature, will look at different indicators. Here is, I will touch on 4 or 5 of these traditional explanations very, very briefly, and I will the PowerPoint it's going to be ready, and the book is ready also for you to read more thoroughly on this. But the idea is that inequality will lead to higher criminality. I couldn't find that. On the opposite, the more equal the country, or the more crime you will see. Why? Let me explain very, very briefly this. Inequality usually is measured by the Gini coefficient. I don't know how familiar are you with this kind of measures, but very briefly, it's the Gini is an indicator that runs from 0 to 1, and 0 means total equality. 1 is total. I'm sorry. Yeah, 0 is equality. 1 is inequality. So, and I did a correlation with reported thefts and with reported homicide, and is that when you see a negative correlation rate, it's in the opposite direction of the theory that predicts more inequality, more crime. But you only see in a very few cases that I underline a positive significant relation that the theory would expect. In short, inequality does not explain, or at least it's not associated with the rate of thefts and homicides. What about growth? Well, you see here on the X, you would see the yearly change in GDP per capita. On the Y, you see the yearly change of homicide rates. And what do you expect? Well, as long as the crime, as the economic expansions grow, or as economy grows, you have to see a declining trend in homicide. That is to say, more better economy, less crime. But you see here the opposite. The line fits very well with an increase of crime, of homicides, with an increase in economic prosperity. That's the puzzle. But the data shows very clear that as the economies expanded, there was more homicide. There were more homicides. Poverty, usually it's associated with more poverty, more crime, usually. But and this is one of the most important indicators of what happened in Latin America at the beginning of the century, is that you see a very dramatic reduction in poverty rates. That's for different programs that were installed in Latin America throughout this period. I'm sure Keith can explain that very well. He worked on several of his works on these issues, and on cities that I will show a little bit later. What you see is it's a reduction both of extreme poverty and moderate poverty. But as I showed before, I mean, there is a significant reduction and there is no less crime. Urban population, usually what you see is as an increase in urbanization in Latin America, more people living in large cities or medium-sized cities. But I will point to the right columns, and you will see that the growth of larger cities is larger between 1970s and 1980s as compared to 1990s and 2000. Yet the crime rate went up more in 1990 to 2000 and less in the earlier period. That is to say that you would expect that more crime would would have been found in the 1970s, but it happened in the 1990s and at the beginning of the century. Again, urbanization will predict a different outcome. And I will not get into these very complicated issues, but there is a theory in criminality that is related to the relative size of the cohort. It basically explains that as the size of younger cohorts is very large, you will expect more crime because people, adolescents and young adults will fight for fewer jobs because there are so many adolescents and young adults in the market. So some of them will divert into criminality. That's the basic theory. I'm not going to get much into this. I found some evidence on that I underline. Well, I'm not going to get too much into that, but there is some evidence on this trend, but not great. So what are the key messages of this section of the traditional explanations? Is that there is no evidence found to account for traditional socioeconomic explanations of crime. And some scattered evidence correlates with criminological theories like social disorganization, control strain, yet the evidence is very weak, I would say. How am I doing with time? Okay. I will go rapidly right now. So my research I tried to collect data on the offenders, what type of crimes they were committed. I tried to understand what drive people to crime and why there were so many people that engage in criminality, and I tried to understand what was the role of the criminal justice system in fighting criminality. So I went, not only me, but a lot of people, we went to, and we did inmate surveys, and we collected data from other sources. So we ran inmate surveys so far for 14 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, but the book is basically using data on the first 6 to 8 countries, depending on the topic. That was the data available for when I finished writing the book. So one of the findings of these projects is that the offenders are not the poorest, but the more motivated people that went to crime because of pursuing higher profits. They were overwhelmingly arrested for committing crime for profits, moving drugs and robberies, and most offenders grew up in environments of crime and broken down communities. Well, this is about a new book coming that is particularly specific, develop these issues, but it's concentrated on the role of prisons. I would be happy in another day to talk about it. What about the criminal justice systems? You would say, well, okay, probably the reasons for the higher criminality is because the criminal justice system doesn't work. I devoted 3 chapters on the criminal justice system of the 9 chapters of the book. I tried to figure it out, what's the role of police, courts, prisons, etc. And this is, well, yeah, Latin American criminal justice system is relatively underdeveloped, has a lot of problems. Here is, counterintuitive. The mean number of convictions per 100,000 between 2003 and 2010, this is scattered data from different regions of the world. You can see the Netherlands there. This is the number of conviction per 100,000. And as you can see on the left side is that Latin American countries convict relatively few people. I'm not suggesting that they should go and convict a lot, but there is a very scattered presence of the state. That's my main message. On the right side, you will see Western Europe, and even the Netherlands are there, 839. As you compare the numbers, as compared to Latin America, they are completely at a different level. This is the, I just bring a couple of pieces of information that I found interesting. What is the time elapsed between committing a crime and being arrested by the police? This is data that we took from the surveys. You know, how we asked inmates how long it took from the moment the alleged crime occurred to the time that you will have been arrested. And as you can see in most countries, you know, if you happen to avoid the first 24 hours of committing the crime, you will be never caught, never caught, never detected. Particularly, most of the crime are being, or most of the offenders are being arrested immediately at the crime scene. Don't pay attention with restricted or for sample, but this is same-day arrest for different type of crime. And what I see, and you can see, is that robbery usually is being detected at the crime scene. And also drugs, which is also a very important driver of criminality. So most of the offenders are being detected and arrested at the crime scenes or very soon afterward. Now, for how much money the crimes, the offenses, the offenders were convicted for the crime, alleged crime. So here is, we ask inmates how much the court says that you rob or you move drugs or whatever. I mean, these are only for crimes for profits. And as you can see, only 4, 5, 6% of the inmates committed crime for higher than $100,000. And 23 or 29 or 24% committed crime higher than $10,000. The median for crimes is less than $2,000. That is to say, people committed relatively committed crime for profits of relatively small scale, low value, and they are being convicted and sent to prisons for 2, 3, 4 years. These are the ones that fill the prison population. I'm not going to devote this, but this is the basic data on changes of prison populations. We have updated in the new book to 2018 and 2019. But as you can see, all prisons in Latin America, and Julian can talk about a lot on these issues, they went up on significant numbers. This is what happens in several of the prisons of Latin America. They do not rehabilitate, they do not incapacitate, they just became temporary warehouses for rotating offenders, or offenders that get in, get out immediately, and then after a few months they got back to prisons. Key findings of the criminal justice systems, they remain weak. There is a variance, though this is not similar to every country of Latin America. I will not get in details here, but there are countries that are doing better than others. Sanctions and punishments were exerted on the last link of the criminal network chain. This is very important. I mean, these are the street robbers are being incarcerated, not the bosses of the rings. And the criminal justice system have not affected the operations of illegal markets. This is critical because they sanction replaceable offenders, and the supply of potential offenders is very large. So what is my argument? I will devote 3 minutes, very basic, 3 minutes or 4 to summarize my argument. So what you see is why crime has went up. Why crime went up. So you see a lot of relative prosperity. I mean, people had more money, particularly the poor, in relative terms, obviously. They were able to purchase new goods, not the top brands goods, but other type of secondary goods in secondary markets of low quality, but still this elicited illegal markets, and the state enforcement capacities remain very weak. That exactly these two, the combination of those two things push for the creation of illegal markets where things are being traded and purchases. And there were few political incentives to disband these markets. If you go to Latin America, every major city of Latin America has a huge or several huge places where you can get from laptops to iPhones to clothing to forfeited goods, whatever. Well, some of these are robbed products from the street, and if you want to get let's say a laptop or a mobile phone, but you cannot buy a new one, a good new one. Different places in the city where you can get, a used mobile phone that is actually coming from a robbery, and you can purchase it by a quarter of the price, or 10% of the price, or 50% of the price, depending on the quality and the type of product. But you see an emerging illegal market of stolen goods. So what I developed is a kind of model that it starts with the two blue circles on the top. That there is a high demand for cheap, illicit, and stolen goods. That's coming from the relative prosperity. And also, I didn't talk on this issue because, I mean, after all, I only have 30 minutes, but there is a high international demand for illegal goods. Everybody knows that Latin America produces illegal drugs, particularly. And there is a high demand, international demand, that engage people or induce people to engage in these trades. And that creates markets, both also not only international markets, but also domestic markets of illegal goods. This develop informal and illegal markets, which is the large reddish kind of at the center, which as the informal markets grew, the enforcement capacities of the state declined or were reduced, and that produced lower deterrence from the states, which again entice or enhance the development of informal markets, kind of an equilibrium between the illegal markets and the weakening enforcement capacities of the state. So if this is correct, criminality is driven by a dramatic rise in crime for profits. That's my main argument that I make in the book. It's not just homicides, it's crime for profits. The social and economic, that produces social and economic conditions that make recruitment relatively easy. A lot of people that cannot find steady jobs can find some jobs in those illegal markets, and some of them volunteer to go and, not volunteer, they try to go and rob, and they make some money out of that. This has also produced the property, or one of the characteristics of my presentation is that property crime growth is the most significant in the regions. Homicides are mostly instrumental and linked to the search for profits. That is to say, when you see the big fights and the lot of homicides, they usually are not conflict, interpersonal conflicts on petty issues of neighborhoods or whatever. You see fights between gangs and between groups that part of their drive is the search for the control of routes or plazas or places to sell the stolen products, etc., etc. This has produced something I don't have time right to explain, but this is very important in Latin America, is the diversification of criminal activities, because once you have a group of people committing crime and they are making profits, other people join them, and then they diversify their the so-called portfolio of criminal activities. And this is extortion, this is also kidnapping for ransom, another type of very, very predatory crimes.
Marcelo?
Yeah.
You have 1 more minute.
Okay. And so this produce, and I will summarize, 2 types of equilibrium. Where you find a strong or relatively strong state or strong deterrence capabilities, you will see relatively low crime equilibrium. This is the case of, as I said, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and in some cases it used to be also Costa Rica, Panama, etc. Where you don't see that, and you see a lot of a strong push for illegality, that's the market stress, or you see a high, what I call high crime equilibrium, which demise enforcement capacities and rapid diversification to profitable predatory crime and markets of crime. These cases are Venezuela, Mexico, some of the states in Brazil, but not, I would not put Brazil, but Colombia in the 90s or 80s and 90s, etc. These are high crime equilibrium where you see staggering numbers of homicides and crime for profit. And this is the low crime equilibrium, as I explained before, high pressures for illegalities. There are moderate enforcement capacities that are capable of, keeping things at bay, not developing large organized crime, but small ones. These are unstable, but you see the ability of states still to put a brake on the development of crime. So I will stop here. Thank you very much, and I looking forward for the comments.
Thank you, Marcelo, for your presentation. It was very interesting, with a lot of data. I'm going to give the floor to Professor Kees Konings, who is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Utrecht and also holds a special chair in Brazilian Studies at CEDLA and the University of Amsterdam.
Thank you, Julienne, and of course, especially thank you, Marcelo, for this fascinating lecture. You cover a complex problem and a complex field with great clarity and competence based on a massive amount of data, not only statistical ones, but also institutional and political and sociological ones. So my comments are based on what you just told us, but also a little bit on my own reading of your 2018 book on Money, More Crime, which is an excellent book, compelling and also very convincing. Because, and you told us today also, what you do is develop a specific perspective on the famous Latin American paradox of how in recent decades this crime and violence indicators went up. And although many, including myself, always link that to democracy, you also bring this in relation to the economy or a political economy, and which makes it even more of a paradox. You convincingly debunk a bunch of traditional explanations. You show how they do not work, and this is important because these stereotypes survive even against all evidence, a little bit like the war on drugs in the US, stubbornly ignoring all indications over the past 30 years that it doesn't work, criminalizing, getting at the source countries rather than at the consumer end of things. But this is all very, very important. And what I also liked a lot in your talk, and also read it in your book, is how it does not necessarily matter the idea of crime and the perception of crime on the absolute levels in a specific country, but more it has to do with the dynamics, with the pace of change, the pace of deepening, or the perception of deepening. So moral panics and the way this is performed, not only by the public, but also I would add by the media and by politicians, adds a lot to that. And I think your work shows this very clearly. And you also put it in a very comprehensive context, and not only looking at social disorganization as a classic from the Chicago School of Sociology, but you also show how it's more than just violent drug traffickers or individual crimes or cartels. You also relate it to the institutional environment of in Latin American countries, which is very interesting. In your book, you also unveil the backgrounds of this criminal agency, their background through the survey, but also how they can be seen as economic actors in a certain way, with profit as a driving force. So all of this, I think, is very convincing and makes your book and your work, this part of your work, very, very key, I think, to understanding this problem, and including also how to solve it, because you conclude your book with 14 recommendations. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I think this is also, they're also very comprehensive and should be read with utmost care, especially by politicians, I would say. That would be a good thing to happen in Latin America. So as a discussant, I'm not going to do my own mini lecture, don't worry. I would basically now wrap this up with one sort of question maybe, and maybe also with a comment, and they are maybe related. Because my question, even having read your book, not in every detail, but my question would be, how could you explain a little bit better or more how rising prosperity generates this kind of profit and business-induced crime in Latin America more than in other parts of the world, where your numbers also show that, and also the perception confirms that crime grows less or declines in most other regions. But there are also regions where prosperity went up in Southeast and East Asia, in Europe, maybe even some African countries. So what happens that in Latin America, this generates this particular criminal political economy, and in other parts of the world it doesn't. And then probably in your answer you're going to introduce the institutional and political dimension, the dimension of governance. And there I would probably find something to discuss, because every good work raises questions. And in your case, Marcelo, I think I would probably take a little bit issue with your notion of weak states and the failure of the public security governance. Not that that's not the case. It obviously is. There are many weaknesses in Latin American states in general, although it's a tricky question how to define it. And it's obvious that law enforcement and public security does not work the way everybody, including the vast majority of Latin American citizens, would like it to work. So it's not about the descriptive part of it, but more the analytical implications it has, because one could argue that stressing weak states and the failure of public security governance and policies means that you would have to fix that, that you would have to strengthen the state, you would have to redesign or train or fund better the police, the criminal justice system, and the prisons. You do a great job in bringing all these three pillars of public security together. That is a very important, I think, There are also a part of this debate also suggests that it's not only a matter of lack of capacity, but that's also a part of a more broadly perverse political economy in which in part the state and politicians and sectors that support these states and politicians are also having are stakeholders in crime and criminal violence, not only for economic reasons, but also for political and maybe even ideological reasons. And in some paper a while ago, I tried to call that, along with many others, a criminal governance that implicates the state in this criminal political economy. And also this needs to be understood and addressed. Otherwise, the risk is that governance measures, like typical examples would be police reform or prison reform or the justice system reform, would be very serious. A lot of people would be involved in them with utmost honesty and capacity. But in the end, it's all coming to naught because the political environment is so hostile. And my question or suggestion for the debate would be, to what extent is this not a more deep-seated problem in which these states and the political elites around them also are very selective in why they care about crime? It's not about getting crime out of the way of every citizen, but only for those class of citizens that are important to them politically, and that those who are most suffering the violence that you also showed. I know that in a country like Brazil, the vast majority of the homicide victims are young, colored men in the favelas killed by firearms. These are victims that are not necessarily interesting for the more privileged. So the incentive not to do something about that the hard way, which is comprehensively changing all this, is like you said, there's a low incentive to change that. But I would say that it's more to do with a sort of a politics and with moral discourses about deserving citizens versus non-deserving citizens than a sort of an administrative or a governance problem. And I would also be interested in hearing from you how you would look at that part of the debate, which I know you follow because you cite Violent Democracies by Arias and Goldstein, among many others. And so I would be very interested also how you see that and how you would relate that to the 14 policy-related recommendations that you end up with in your book. You didn't include them in your talk, but maybe you can bring them to the public as part of your rebuttal. But I enjoyed your book and your lecture very much. It's an important work. And regardless of the academic debate we can build around it, it's an important voice for the Latin American security community to take into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kees. Marcelo, I will give you a few minutes to respond to Kees's discussion points. And in the meantime, I would like to ask people who would like to ask a question to indicate so in the chat. We will stop, I think the recording will stop before the question round starts, so you can feel free to show your face without ending up on a recording. So please indicate if you have a question in the chat. We'll probably have time before 5 for just one round of questions. Please keep your questions short and succinct so that it's easier for Marcelo to grasp them. And I do want to say that before it turns 5 o'clock, etc., that Marcelo will unfortunately not be able to accompany us to the informal room. So we will take some 10 or 15 minutes into this Zoom time, compounding the lecture to be able to discuss or have a second round of questions with Marcelo, because he is unfortunately unavailable for the social drinks afterwards.
Should I go?
Yes.
It is indeed unfortunate that I could not join you later on. For me, it's very, very early for drinks, but that's not the case. Let me thank you very much, Kees. These are wonderful comments, and I, as you can imagine, I share many of them with you. Some of them I didn't tackle in the book, and this is a very, very large topic, and I have very ambitious I had ideas that I wanted to put across, and it's very difficult to prove them, some of them. So I try to do my best and try to explain what happened in the region over a certain period. That put me in a spot when I look into, because I thought about the Southeast Asia and other regions of the world that indeed had more prosperity, and they didn't show, at least official data didn't show large increases in criminality. What I'm trying to explain is that deterrence, that is to say, the ability to states or other forces to induce certain type of behavior from people, is not only exerted by states. There are other social mechanisms that makes people to comply with rules, abide by laws, etc. So I am not an expert in Africa or South Asia by any means, and I don't know what happened. But usually, traditional societies where bonds and links and adherence to certain rules are very successful in inducing people to certain type of behavior. This is in general theories of law abidance. So I've never written about that, and I'm not an expert, but my suspicion is that other forces are at work in other places of the world that make people to comply and not to develop this kind of high type of criminality. In addition to that, Latin America, and this is very important, and you mentioned it, Keith, it's strategically located as a big supplier of drugs. And that brought to the regions a lot of arms, guns, organizations that later on allowed to develop the infrastructures of other type of criminal markets and criminal activities. So what you can see is the explosion of the war on drugs that occurred in the 80s and the 90s allows the development of markets of crimes later on. So that was a triggering process. So as I said, unfortunately, I cannot answer why other parts of the world, I mean, that will invite me to do other research for another 10 years, so probably I will not do it. But my suspicion is that other parts of the world did not develop with relatively weak states, who did not develop that kind of markets because they did not allow the countries to. The states were very weak, but other forces are at work to develop, abidance to rules. I will make another comment, very brief comment, is to your very good point about the political incentives to have crime under control or not. And the case of Brazil is very paradigmatic, but you can find that in other countries in the region. Usually, and this has to do with something that you and others work extensively on, the relationship with democracy and criminality. Usually, elected officials are interested in votes, and votes. Although everybody has a vote, the power of some politicians can entice different neighborhoods to in different cities. I mean, elected officials react to different groups and the power of different groups in different cities or different states. And what you see is that when elected officials try to do some reforms is to benefit for both. That is to say, there is no other benefits that they can extract from criminality unless they need the financing and the funding to run electoral campaigns. And this is a topic that has not been studied, that's not been researched thoroughly in the regions, but I believe, as you do, Keith, that you know, there is a whole issue there where part of this criminal activity goes directly to political campaigns. Not all of that, only part of it, but so elected officials and politicians and even bureaucrats also reap profits of these criminal activities. And we see evidence in most of the countries of the region. So I would stop here because it's almost time, but I will give a brief comment to a brief time to comments or other questions.
Thank you, Marcelo. I would like to give the floor to first to Tadeo Berge and then Kai Thompson to ask their 2 questions, and then you can answer them together.
Yes. Hello, Marcelo. Thank you very much.